week on Perspective, the power of cities on the global stage. When we talk about foreign affairs and international diplomacy, it's most often a conversation about relationships and agreements between nation states. We saw that at play at the recent NATO and G7 summits. This week, we want to look at foreign affairs from a slightly different perspective, that of cities, mostly big cities. This past week, President Donald Trump announced the U.S. will withdraw from the landmark Paris Climate Change Agreement. He described it as a reassertion of American sovereignty. He also offered this.
I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris.
Within moments, the mayor of Pittsburgh signaled, well, he's with Paris. As the mayor of Pittsburgh, William Peduto, wrote, "I can assure you that we will follow the guidelines of the Paris Agreement for our people, our economy, and future." The mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, also said his city is stepping up.
We in New York City are going to have to take matters into our own hands. And by the way, that's what cities all over the country and all over the world are going to do. That's what states and provinces are doing. It shouldn't be this way, but it's what's necessary. We have to take matters into our own hands when it comes to climate change. We plan later this week to sign an executive order maintaining New York City's commitment to the Paris Agreement.
By the end of the week, more than 80 U.S. mayors committed to uphold the Paris Agreement. They and others may be thumbing their noses at Trump and his policies, but this also highlights the powerful and independent role cities can play in global affairs. Consider this. The 50 largest metropolitan areas across the globe are home to just 7% of the world's total population, but generate 40% of global economic activity. Lump some of those cities together into mega regions. Think, for example, the Boston, New York, Washington corridor. And 40 mega regions account for roughly 2/3 of the world's economic output and more than 85% of its innovation. That's clout. But also, consider this. Big cities are also home to a deepening inequality, the much talked about decline of the middle class, realities we've watched play out in several recent elections, not just in the U.S. It's what Richard Florida, the influential urban theorist, calls the new urban crisis. We'll hear from Florida in a moment. We'll also speak with one of the world's experts on what's sometimes called paradiplomacy, the international role of cities and provinces and states. We'll also hear perspectives from Canada and Africa. But we begin with Richard Florida. As well as an author, he is a professor and director of cities at the Martin Prosperity Institute at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. That's where we met. We've all watched the growing political divides manifest themselves in some election results. We've watched Brexit, even the election in France, although the result was slightly different, the concerns in the Netherlands, Italy, the United States. People talk about political divides, but you say there's something else to it, that it relates to urbanization. How so?
Well, I'm an American who transplanted to Toronto about a decade ago, and I came here, I guess, with rose-colored glasses, seeing a great, progressive, kind of an urbanist dream, the place that the great late urbanist Jane Jacobs moved. And, I wasn't here but a few years, and Rob Ford, I think the original prototypical populist swept into office. And at that time, I said, let's discount Rob Ford. He's a product of this divide between the so-called urban elite, the knowledge workers, the professionals, the young people, the highly educated living downtown, near the universities, near subway stops and transit, and the people who are living at the outskirts, the people who are being pushed either into less advantaged, less transit-served neighborhoods in the city or out to the suburbs and exurbs and commuting a long way to work. Now I never would have expected Brexit, and Lord God, as somebody who's American by birth, never expected Trump. But they're all product of the same thing. And it's not just economic inequality, which lots of people have talked about. It's a geographic or spatial inequality where there are just a very small number of cities, London in the UK, Paris in France, Amsterdam in the Netherlands, Toronto and Vancouver, and maybe a few others in Canada, New York, LA, San Francisco in the United States. Those cities are growing very powerful. They're attracting people, they're attracting investment, they're attracting media, finance, entertainment. Tech companies are flowing back to these downtowns. And then other people are falling further behind, both within those cities, but even more so between them. So what we're getting is this backlash. I call it the political contradiction of capitalism. The very same clustering force that drives innovation, that causes people to locate in cities, divides us, creates this anger and anxiety and a political backlash, which actually threatens that very source of innovation to begin with.
So I was going to say, so urbanization is the answer to economic growth in some fashion, or propellant of economic growth, but it's also the problem too.
Yeah, it's this, you know, Jane Jacobs identified, it wasn't me, you know, this great urbanist who migrated from New York City's Greenwich Village to Toronto. She said, look, what happens to grow an economy is not simply that there's technologies that are discovered by great, you know, inventors, or entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates create a new company. It's that talented and creative people of all stripes, of all ethnicities, of all races, both genders, they clash and clamor in a city. And as they do, they create new ideas, they create new companies. So the city itself, in a way, that clustered city is the platform for innovation and economic growth. But of course, because we only have a little bit of land, and the tech companies and the financial companies and the rich people and everyone's competing for that little small slivers of land, people get pushed out. And then we become divided. Those who can bid the highest for the land get it. Those who can't get pushed further and further afield, they are denied economic opportunity. They are not included. And so we've developed a system in Canada, the United States, the advanced nations, that I've come to call winner-take-all urbanism. You know, there are winner cities and loser cities. There are winner neighborhoods and loser neighborhoods. And what that does is make people think, oh my God, other parts of my city or other cities are doing great and I'm being left behind, and I want to be part of it. They don't know this, they don't know how, but that's where that divide comes from. And the backlash in the form of populism, Trumpism, I'm going to tear it down. The heck with that. I'm going to tear it down because people unlike me are in their minds are benefiting. So it's that divide that really becomes the constraint. And that's why I think the one message of my book, The New Urban Crisis, is we've got to get over winner-take-all urbanism. We've got to close these divides. We've got to create what I call an urbanism for all, or a more inclusive way of growing, a more inclusive way of innovating, a more inclusive prosperity that more people in more places can participate in.
One of the things you also point out, though, is that liberal cities tend to have more inequality than less liberal cities. And liberals would pride themselves on being more inclusive, you know, proponents of a more sharing economy.
Capitalism, and particularly our age of what I call urbanized knowledge capitalism, is no longer industrial capitalism, is rife with contradictions, as one great social scientist once said. This contradiction that it's the largest, it's the densest, it's the most vibrant, the most knowledge-based, the most technologically intensive, and the most liberal cities and metro areas that are the most unequal, the most class divided, that have the smallest middle classes, and have the highest levels of segregation. As I go around this country and around the United States talking to people, mayors, city planners, business leaders, university heads are saying, we've tried to build affordable housing, we've tried to invest in transit, we've tried to create better jobs, we've tried to create new pre-kindergarten and other training programs. It hasn't worked. The reason it hasn't worked is we haven't integrated them, and we haven't done this at enough scale. So this is a big challenge, how to build a more inclusive city, how to create a more less winner-take-all urbanism, and more of an urbanism for all is a big, big agenda.
From the way you talk, and you talk about superstar cities, it sounds like, you know, cities like London and Los Angeles and New York and Toronto and those sort of big cities have more in common than they do perhaps even with cities in their own communities, in their own countries. Yet our political structures don't reflect any of that, sort of the necessity for cities to kind of make a difference. What's the answer? Well,
I think in advanced countries, and I would say the advanced countries of Europe, of course, Canada and the United States, there's only one way out of this. We've built these nation states. Now Canada's kind of unique and interesting here because our nation state is less powerful. Our provinces are more powerful, our cities are weaker. In the United States, look, Donald Trump is a symptom of the disorder. That presidency, that imperial presidency is way too powerful. You see it when there's someone who can't do the job. But in a country of 350 million people with thousands of municipalities, why do you 50 states? You don't want to concentrate all that power in one person. So what I believe we need to do, and many of us, this isn't just me, there are really important thinkers on the left, the late Benjamin Barber, the political theorist, Bruce Katz from the Brookings Institute, many. On the right, Yuval Levin, who writes for the National Review. Everyone is kind of saying, we need to begin to think of ways to move power away from the nation state and even down from the provinces appropriately and empower our cities and communities, because there isn't one size fits all. This is really important.
But that means giving them the power to raise money. What federal national politician is going to devolve the right to raise taxes to someone other than themselves?
Well, hopefully we will see a coalition, a bipartisan coalition of city leaders and mayors make this case. And it's happening in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is having a big conversation under conservative leadership about how do we devolve power to our cities and metro areas. But here's what I think is really important. The problems of Toronto and Vancouver and maybe Montreal are really different than the problems of Windsor or Hamilton. The mayors all want to build great cities, so I think that's what we have to do. We have to work to really get the appropriate level of resources and power in the hands of our cities and our neighborhoods and let them build the kinds of communities and make the investments they need.
Let's put the developing world into this context now, because obviously urbanization is a real factor there too. And one of the statistics you quote that said something like more than 60% of the infrastructure needed over the next half century has yet to be built. And I assume that means, I mean, not only in developed countries, but in developing nations as well. What does this mean for developing countries?
So the 21st century will be the century of cities and urbanization. We will put more cities, more billions of people, it could be as many as 5 or 6 billion people as our population swells, are going to move from rural areas into cities. We're going to spend more building, more hundreds of trillions of dollars building cities and infrastructure in the next century than we have throughout all of human history. And two things that the book points out is that if the new urban crisis is significant in Canada or the United States or the developed world, it's much more serious in the developing and rapidly urbanizing world. Two things are happening. The first is more and more economists are seeing a process they call urbanization without growth. In Canada, in the United States and Europe, as societies urbanize, they industrialize, they grow a middle class, and all boats, maybe not all boats, many boats rose. But in the developing world, we're seeing urbanization without growth. People are coming in from the countryside, economic opportunity isn't there, they're being literally living in what are called global slums. And the statistic that the UN has is so terrifying and so distressing. 860 million people in this era of urbanization live in global slums. That is more than the entire population of Canada, the United States, and the entire European Union combined, living in abject poverty, without sanitation, without electricity. So really, I believe the grand challenge facing our world, and whether that's the UN or the World Bank or the IMF, our international institutions, our great national leaders, if we want to address climate change, energy efficiency, poverty, economic opportunity, it really is about building better cities, more sustainable, more inclusive cities of economic opportunity. So I really believe that the key issue going forward is how do we build better cities, better urbanization, stronger communities, not just in the advanced world, but especially in the developing and emerging
So I was going to say, so what does that say about the way governments like Canada should approach, their foreign development and foreign investment and foreign aid?
I think there are two great opportunities for Canada here. One, I think, with the current, the Prime Minister, our provincial leaders and our mayors, we have a great opportunity to make Canada and its cities and communities a laboratory for inclusive prosperity. One way I like to say this, it's kind of a wonky word. Let's have a new deal for people and communities throughout Canada. Not the slogan, make America great or make Canada. Let's have a new deal for people and communities. We can create better jobs. We can build our communities, small, medium-sized, big, west, east alike. And so I think city building and making inclusive cities and inclusive communities. But on the second front, the global front, what an opportunity for this country to engage the world by saying, we are going to help spur development through not nation building, city building. We are going to be the place, the UN is in New York. We're going to be the place where mayors and city builders and urban leaders, we can create, I don't have the right word, a UN for cities, a place where mayors can convene, a global infrastructure for mayors, and no one else has done this. Why couldn't we, because we know how to build great cities, we know how to have an urban comeback, why couldn't we create the training programs and the infrastructure and the symposium and create the institutions that are needed to rebuild our world by building great and vibrant, tolerant and inclusive cities? I think that's an agenda that Canada could really lead the world on.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your expertise and your insight.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being with you.